The front door opened before I could say one word. I was standing in the grand foyer of my childhood home with my 1-year-old daughter, Maisie, on my hip, still wearing my army dress uniform, while my mother and brother stared at me like I had committed some terrible crime. My brother, Desmond, had just slapped a DNA test onto the marble console table and said, cold as ice, "You're not his daughter. You're a fraud, Callista." Then my mother, Eleanor, her face a mask of aristocratic fury, pointed at the door and screamed, "Get out of my house. You are no longer my child. You never were a thorn." That was the moment the front door opened again, and the man who stepped inside made every person in that room go silent. But let me back up a little. That morning, I had been at the intelligence wing of the base, finishing a mountain of debriefing paperwork after a grueling stretch of active duty. I was tired in that deep-down military way, the kind of tired that settles into your marrow and makes your eyes burn. But I was fueled by a flicker of hope. My father, Silas Thorne, had passed away 3 weeks prior while I was stationed overseas. I hadn't even been able to make it to the funeral due to the nature of my assignment. Today was supposed to be the day I finally reunited with my family, grieved with my mother, and met the lawyer to handle the transition of the estate Silas had spent 40 years building. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, my phone had buzzed. It was a message from Desmond. "The family is gathering at the manor tonight. Be there by 6 o'clock sharp. Mom has something she needs to tell you before the reading tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long time. My relationship with Desmond and Eleanor had always been strained. They viewed my military career as a rebellious phase that lasted a decade, but I thought my father's death would bridge the gap. I thought grief might finally make them see me. I texted back a simple "I'll be there," and spent the rest of my shift imagining a warm, if somber, homecoming. When I picked up Maisie from the base daycare, she squealed and reached for me, her tiny hands tugging at the lapels of my uniform. "Mama, Mama," she chirped, oblivious to the weight on my chest. I strapped her into her car seat, smoothed her chestnut hair, the same shade as my father's, and drove toward the Thorne estate. The drive was 3 hours of winding roads and heavy thoughts. I kept thinking about Silas. He was the only one who ever encouraged me to forge my own path. "A thorn doesn't just follow the money, Callista," he used to tell me. "A thorn follows their duty." The manor looked imposing as I pulled into the long, gravel driveway. The lights were blazing in the drawing room, and several expensive cars lined the front. Desmond's new Italian sports car and Eleanor's vintage sedan were parked right at the entrance. I remember thinking, maybe they've prepared a dinner. Maybe we can finally be a family again. But as soon as I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the smell of a home-cooked meal that greeted me. It was the sterile, suffocating scent of a trap. The living room was filled with the extended Thorne clan, aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't seen in years. No one offered a hand. No one said they were sorry for my loss. They all sat there like a jury. Desmond was standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of scotch, while Eleanor sat perfectly upright on the velvet sofa. Before I could even put Maisie down, Desmond threw that envelope onto the table. "The results came in this morning, Callista," he said, his voice dripping with a cruel kind of satisfaction. "We knew Silas was always too blind to see it, but Mom knew. The DNA test proves it. You aren't a thorn. You're the product of an arrangement Mom had 30 years ago when Silas was traveling. You've been living off our name and his money long enough." I felt the air leave my lungs. Maisie sensed the tension and gripped my neck tighter. "Desmond, what are you talking about?" "That's impossible," I whispered. Eleanor stood up, her pearls clinking. "Don't you dare use that tone in this house. You are a stain on your father's memory, or rather, the man you called father. We've already contacted the JAG office to inform them of your fraudulent status. Now, take that child and leave before I call the police for trespassing." I was reeling, my mind racing through 30 years of memories, trying to find a lie where I only knew the truth. But before I could defend myself, the heavy oak doors behind me creaked open. A deep, resonant voice filled the foyer. "Captain Thorne." Everyone turned. Major General Octavius Grimm stepped into the room. He was in full army service uniform, the 3 stars on his shoulders gleaming under the chandelier. He carried a leather-bound folder under his arm, and his eyes, as sharp as a hawk's, swept the room with a cold, tactical precision. The Thorne family, who valued nothing more than status and power, suddenly found themselves in the presence of real authority. "General Graham," I stammered, instinctively shifting into a more formal posture despite the child on my hip. "Sir, I wasn't expecting you here." "I was a close friend of Silas," Grimm said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And I am here to ensure that his daughter is treated with the respect her rank and her lineage deserve." He looked at the paper on the coffee table, then at Desmond, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. I seemed to have walked into a mutiny. The silence was deafening. Eleanor tried to regain her composure, smoothing her skirt. "General, this is a private family matter. Callista has just been informed that she is not actually a part of this family." General Grimm didn't flinch. He walked over to the console table, picked up the DNA report with 2 fingers as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence, and scanned it. "An unverified report from a private laboratory in the Caymans?" He looked at Desmond. "I've seen better forgeries from insurgent groups in the desert, son. This is a pathetic attempt at a power grab." "It's real," Desmond shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Grimm asked. He turned to me. "Captain Thorne, you and the child are leaving with me. You will not spend another minute in a house where the walls are painted with such cowardice." He looked back at my mother. "Silas Thorne was many things, Eleanor, but he wasn't a fool. He left me instructions in case you and your son decided to play these games." I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I turned my back on the people I had called my family, following the general out into the cool night air. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely click Maisie into her seat. General Grimm stood by my car, his presence a silent shield against the shadows of the manor. "Take this," he said, handing me a small, encrypted thumb drive. "Silas gave this to me 6 months ago. He knew his health was failing, and he knew Desmond's debts were piling up. He told me that when the wolves started circling, I was to give this only to you." "Where should I go, sir?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Go to Captain Vance's place. She's already expecting you," he replied. "And Callista, don't look at that drive until you are behind a secure firewall. Your father was a man of many secrets, but his greatest one was how much he anticipated this betrayal." I drove away from the Thorne estate, watching the lights of the manor fade in the rearview mirror. I went straight to Brianna Vance's small apartment. Brianna was my best friend from the academy, a woman who had saved my life more than once in the field. She didn't ask questions, she just took Maisie, gave me a cup of black coffee, and pointed toward her guest room where a secure laptop was waiting. As the city of Raleigh slept, I sat in the glow of the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I plugged in the drive. It was protected by a 24-character password, a code only I would know. It was the coordinates of the first place my father had ever taken me fishing. I typed it in, and the folders blossomed across the screen. There were bank statements, yes, but there were also recordings. I clicked on a file dated 2 months before Silas died. The audio was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. It was Desmond and Eleanor. "We have to make sure the lawyer is on our side, Mom," Desmond's voice hissed. "If Silas leaves her the controlling interest in the firm, we're finished. I owe too much to the Sterling Group. They'll take the house if I don't pay." "I'll handle the DNA angle," Eleanor replied, her voice cold and calculating. "If she's not a legal heir, the will's primary clauses for the bloodline will default to you. We just need her out of the way before the reading. She's a soldier, she'll react with pride and walk away. She always does." I felt a cold rage settle over me. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a conspiracy to defraud me of my father's legacy and my daughter's future. But as I scrolled further down, I found a document that made my blood run cold. It was a draft of a new will, one that hadn't been shared with the family's regular legal team. At the bottom of the document, Silas had written a note in his own handwriting, scanned into the file, for Callista. They think they know the game, but they've forgotten who taught it to them. The next morning, the official reading of the Thorne estate will was set to take place at the offices of Sterling and Associates. I arrived 20 minutes early, not in my uniform this time, but in a sharp, charcoal gray suit. I looked like the daughter of Silas Thorne. Eleanor and Desmond were already in the conference room, looking smug. They had a new lawyer with them, a man who looked like he specialized in making problems disappear. When I walked in, Desmond chuckled. "Still trying to play the part, Callista? We told you, you're not welcome here." I didn't answer. I sat down at the far end of the mahogany table. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a man I had never seen before walked in. He wasn't the usual family attorney. He was older, with silver hair and an air of immense gravity. He carried a heavy briefcase and a look of profound disappointment as he glanced at Eleanor and Desmond. "My name is Mr. Thaddeus Sterling," he announced, his voice like grinding stone. "And I am the executor of Silas Thorne's true and final testament. Before we begin, I suggest you and your son sit down and remain silent. Because what I am about to read is going to change the rest of your lives." Desmond started to protest, but Mr. Sterling held up a hand, silencing him instantly. He looked at me and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Then, he opened the thick folder and cleared his throat. "There is a preamble to this will," Sterling said. "One that Silas insisted be read specifically in the presence of his daughter, Callista, and those who sought to disparage her." He began to read, and as the words filled the room, the color began to drain from my mother's face. My father hadn't just left me a house or a business, he had left me a weapon. And as the lawyer turned to the page regarding the lineage clauses, I realized that the trap Desmond and Eleanor had set was about to snap shut, on their own necks. Mr. Thaddeus Sterling didn't just read the words, he performed them, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had held the Thorne family's darkest secrets for 40 years. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes cold as he looked at Eleanor and Desmond. "Silas Thorne was a man of immense foresight," Sterling began. "He knew that his passing would bring out the vultures. He specifically requested that I address the matter of purity first, as he anticipated certain members of this family would attempt to use bloodline as a weapon." Desmond shifted in his chair, his face slick with sweat. "We have proof, Sterling. Callista isn't a Thorne. We have the DNA results from a private lab. She's an interloper, a mistake that should have been erased years ago." Eleanor nodded, her chin tilted high. "My husband was a proud man, Thaddeus. He wouldn't want his empire going to a girl who shares none of his genetic legacy. We are simply protecting the Thorne name." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. My training as a military intelligence officer took over. In the field, you don't react to the noise, you watch the movement. I watched Desmond's hands, they were shaking. I watched Eleanor's eyes, they kept darting to the briefcase Sterling had placed on the table. They weren't confident, they were desperate. "Is that so?" Sterling said, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. He pulled a heavy, cream-colored envelope from the file. It bore the seal of the Department of Defense. "Then it is fortunate that Silas Thorne took measures years ago. Callista, your father knew your career in military intelligence would require the highest level of scrutiny. When you were commissioned as an officer, Silas provided a voluntary DNA sample to be cross-referenced with your security clearance file. He wanted to ensure that no one, not even his own wife, could ever question your place in this world." The color drained from Eleanor's face. She looked like she had been struck. "What? He did what?" "Silas Thorne submitted a certified, notarized, and federally witnessed DNA profile 10 years ago," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I have the results here. They were unsealed this morning by a court order Silas signed in anticipation of his death. The results are conclusive. Callista Thorne is 99.9% his biological daughter. There is no room for debate. There is no room for private labs or anonymous tips. That's impossible, Desmond stammered, standing up so quickly his chair screeched against the floor. The test we ran. The test you fabricated, Desmond? I spoke for the first time, my voice calm, icy, and sharp. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my brother. I've been tracking your communications for the last 48 hours. I know about the technician you bribed at the clinic on 4th Street. I know about the $50,000 transfer you made from the company's petty cash to hide the paper trail. You didn't just try to disown me, you committed fraud against a federal officer's estate. Eleanor gasped, looking at her son in horror. Desmond, you told me the results were real. They were supposed to be, he hissed back, his facade crumbling. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. The preamble continues. And this is where it gets interesting. Silas wrote, to my wife, Eleanor, who spent more time in the beds of my competitors than in the home we built, I leave you exactly what you brought into this marriage, nothing. The prenuptial agreement stands, bolstered by the evidence of your infidelities which I have archived for the court. You are to vacate the Thorne Manor within 48 hours. You may take your personal clothing, but the jewelry, the art, and the keys stay. Eleanor's scream was raw, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. He can't do this. I spent 30 years with that man. And 20 of them were spent lying to him, Sterling retorted without looking up. He turned the page. To my son, Desmond. Silas wrote, I watched you grow into a man who values shortcuts over sweat. You are weak, Desmond. You are easily bought, and you are currently $4 million in debt to the Sterling Group, a debt I secretly purchased 6 months ago. As of this moment, I am the owner of your lifestyle. Since I am deceased, that ownership now transfers to my primary heir. Desmond sank back into his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The primary heir? You mean? We split it? Sterling looked at me, a genuine look of respect in his eyes. No. Silas was very clear. Thorne Industries is a primary contractor for the United States military. It requires a leader with a high-level security clearance, a strategic mind, and a sense of duty that cannot be corrupted. There is only one person in this room who fits that description. He turned the document toward me. Callista Thorne, your father has left you 51% of the voting shares of Thorne Industries, the manor, the liquid assets in his private accounts, and the authority to settle all outstanding family debts, including your brother's. The silence that followed was heavy. I thought of Maisie, sleeping in her crib at the hotel, guarded by Brianna Vance. My daughter's future was no longer a question mark, it was a fortress, but I wasn't done. Silas had given me the pieces, but I was the one who had to play the game. This is a lie. Eleanor shrieked, lunging toward the table. I'll contest it. I'll drag this through the courts for a decade. You'll never see a dime, you little brat. At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, followed by a man whose presence filled the room like a thundercloud. He was in full uniform, the stars on his shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Major General Octavius Grimm didn't look at Eleanor or Desmond. He walked straight to the head of the table and stood behind me. Captain Thorne, he said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded instant silence. General Grimm, I replied, standing up to salute. He returned the salute with a crisp, professional motion. I was a close friend of your father's, Callista. He was a patriot who understood that the technology Thorne Industries develops is vital to national security. He also understood that in the wrong hands, hands like your brother's, that technology could be sold to the highest bidder. The general turned his gaze toward Eleanor and Desmond. They looked small, withered under the weight of his stare. As of 10 minutes ago, the Department of Defense has placed Thorne Industries under a temporary protective status. Since Captain Thorne holds the necessary clearances and is now the majority owner, she is the only civilian authorized to be on these premises or in the family manor until a full audit is completed. He looked at the 2 security guards. Escort Mrs. Thorne and her son out of the building. They are not to take anything but their cell phones. Any attempt to remove company property or personal assets belonging to the estate will be treated as a federal offense. You can't do this, Desmond yelled as a guard grabbed his arm. This is a private company. It's a company with a Tier 1 defense contract, Mr. Thorne, General Grimm said coldly. Which makes it my business. Move. I watched as my mother and brother were led out. Eleanor was sobbing, her composure completely shattered, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Desmond was silent, the reality of his $4 million debt finally sinking in. He was no longer the prince of the city, he was a debtor to the sister he had tried to destroy. Once the doors closed, the room felt lighter. The air was cleaner. Mr. Sterling let out a long sigh and closed the file. Your father would be proud, Callista. He told me once that you were the only Thorne who ever understood that power isn't something you inherit, it's something you defend. I didn't want it this way, Thaddeus, I said, looking at the empty chairs where my family had sat. I just wanted a father who was still alive. He knew that, Sterling said gently. But he also knew you were the only one strong enough to carry the weight. General Grimm placed a hand on my shoulder. Captain, I have a transport waiting to take you to the manor. Your friend, Captain Vance, is already there with your daughter. We've secured the perimeter. You have a lot of work to do. Silas left a final set of instructions in a secure server, intelligence he gathered on the people who were trying to dismantle his company from the inside. I nodded, my mind already shifting gears. Thank you, sir. I need to see Maisie first. Understood. But remember, Callista, Eleanor and Desmond are the least of your worries. Your father's competitors heard he was dead before his body was cold. They're going to come for the Thorne legacy. And they won't use lawyers next time. As I walked out of the office, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was a captain in the United States Army. I was a mother. And now, I was the head of the Thorne Empire. The drive to the manor was silent. The city blurred past the tinted windows of the black SUV. When we pulled up to the massive iron gates, I saw the military police standing guard. My childhood home had become a command post. I stepped out of the car and saw Brianna Vance standing on the front porch, holding Maisie. My daughter saw me and let out a squeal of joy, her little arms reaching out. I took her from Brianna, burying my face in her neck, breathing in the scent of baby powder and home. Is it over? Brianna asked softly. No, I said, looking at the sprawling estate that was now mine. It's just beginning. My father didn't just leave me a fortune, Bri. He left me a war. And I'm going to win it. I walked into the house, the heavy doors closing behind me. I didn't know then that the secrets hidden in Silas Thorne's private study would lead me into a conspiracy that went far beyond my family, a conspiracy that would test every ounce of my intelligence training and put everything I loved at risk. But as I looked down at Maisie, I knew one thing for certain, no one was ever going to tell us we didn't belong again. The heavy oak doors of my father's study didn't just lead into a room, they led into a different life. As I stepped inside, the scent of expensive tobacco and old parchment hit me, the scent of Silas Thorne. Brianna followed me, Maisie balanced on her hip, while two of General Grimm's men took positions outside the door. This place always gave me the creeps, Brianna whispered, looking at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It feels like he's still watching. He is, I said, my eyes landing on the mahogany desk. Silas never left anything to chance. If he knew he was dying, he spent his last months building a fortress. I just didn't realize I was the one who would have to man the walls. I sat in his chair. It was too big for me, designed for a man who commanded empires, but as I rested my hands on the leather, I felt a strange surge of adrenaline. My military intelligence training was kicking in. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore, I was an officer on a mission. Thaddeus mentioned a secure server, I said, turning the monitor on the desk. Grimm said the access was biometric. I placed my thumb on the glass scanner embedded in the desk. A soft blue light swept over my skin. Access denied, I tried again. Access denied, my heart sank. Had he changed his mind at the last second? Then I remembered something Silas used to say when I was a teenager practicing marksmanship. Callista, never look at the target. Look at the wind. The target is where you want to be, but the wind is what gets you there. I looked at the desk. Not the scanner, but the surface. There was a small, almost invisible indentation near the edge where he used to tap his signet ring when he was thinking. I pressed it. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing a second, more advanced scanner. This one wasn't for a thumbprint. It was for a retinal scan. I leaned in. A red laser flickered across my eye. Welcome, Captain Thorne. Initializing Project Aegis. The monitor didn't show bank accounts or stock portfolios. It showed a map of the city, dotted with red icons. Each icon represented a threat, people who had been systematically draining Thorne Industries for years. At the top of the list, highlighted in flashing amber, were two names I knew all too well, Eleanor and Desmond. But they weren't the biggest threat. There was a name beneath them, a shadow entity called the Meridian Group. Brianna, look at this, I said, pointing to the screen. He wasn't just tracking their spending. He was tracking their betrayals. My mother wasn't just buying jewelry, she was selling board seats to Meridian. And Desmond, he didn't just lose $4 million at a poker table. He lost it to a front company owned by our biggest competitor. Brianna shifted Maisie to her other hip, her face hardening. They were selling the company out from under him while he was still breathing. Worse, I said, scrolling through the encrypted files. They were planning to use the inheritance to pay off the debts they incurred by betraying him. Silas knew. He used Thaddeus and General Grimm to wait for the exact moment they thought they had won to pull the rug out. Suddenly, the house's internal comms buzzed. IT was the security detail at the front gate. Captain Thorne, we have a situation. Your mother and brother have returned. They're accompanied by a legal team and what looks like a local news crew. They're claiming you're holding them out of their own home by force. I looked at Brianna. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips. They want a show? Let's give them a masterclass in psychological warfare. I stood up, adjusting my uniform jacket. Bree, keep Maisie in the nursery. General Grimm's men will stay with you. I'm going to go talk to my family. As I walked down the grand staircase, I could hear the shouting before I even reached the foyer. Eleanor's voice was high-pitched and frantic, the sound of a woman who had realized her safety net had been incinerated. Open this door immediately. I am the widow of Silas Thorne. This is my house. I nodded to the security team. Open it. The massive doors swung inward. Eleanor surged forward, her face a mask of calculated fury, followed by Desmond, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the last hour. Behind them were 4 men in cheap suits, lawyers trying to look expensive, and a cameraman with a shoulder-mounted rig. Callista! Eleanor screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. This ends now. We are filing an emergency injunction. That will is a forgery, and your general has no jurisdiction here. You are an imposter, and I will see you court-martialed for using military assets for personal gain. I stood at the base of the stairs, my hands clasped behind my back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Mother, you're making a scene. And Desmond, I'd hide that camera if I were you. Recording on private property without the owner's consent is a felony in this state. The owner? Desmond spat, stepping forward. You think because Dad left you a piece of paper, you're the queen? That company belongs to the board. And the board is already meeting to strip you of every power you think you have. Is that so? I stepped closer to him, so close he had to look up. Which board members, Desmond? The ones you promised 10% of the equity to if they voted to remove Silas? Or the ones Eleanor has been bribing with the charity funds she's been laundering through her boutique? The color drained from Eleanor's face. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat. I don't know what you're talking about. I have the ledger, Eleanor, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent foyer. I have the biometric recordings of every meeting you held in this house while Dad was too weak to leave his bed. I have the bank routing numbers to the Meridian Group. And most importantly, I have the evidence of the medication you were giving Silas during his final weeks. Desmond lunged for me. You bitch. He never reached me. Before he could take a second step, Major General Octavius Grimm stepped out from the shadows of the dining room. He didn't say a word, he just placed a hand on his holster. Desmond froze midair, the reality of his situation finally clashing with his ego. Captain Thorne, Grimm said, his voice like grinding stones. The transport for the evidence is secure. Should I have these individuals removed from the premises? Not yet, General, I said. I want them to hear this. I turned back to Eleanor. Thaddeus Sterling is currently at the district attorney's office. Silas knew you were poisoning the company, but he also suspected you were poisoning him. He had a private autopsy performed the moment he passed. The results came back this morning. Eleanor's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a shroud. Silas was sick. It was the cancer. It was the treatment you insisted on, Mother. A cocktail of drugs that weren't prescribed by any doctor on his file. I looked at the lawyers, who were already beginning to back away toward the door. Gentlemen, if I were you, I'd leave. Unless you want your names on the conspiracy indictment that's being drafted as we speak. They didn't need to be told twice. They vanished, leaving the cameraman standing there awkwardly until Grimm pointed to the exit. Desmond was trembling now. Callista, please. We're family. I was in over my head. The people I owe money to. They'll kill me if I don't pay. Then I suggest you start running, I said, my heart feeling like a block of ice. Because you aren't getting a cent from the Thorne estate. You and Mother have 10 minutes to go upstairs and pack one suitcase each. Anything else you take will be considered theft. The cars, the jewelry, the clothes, they were all bought with company funds. They belong to me now. You can't do this. Eleanor wailed from the floor. I am your mother. A mother doesn't try to destroy her daughter's life to cover her own greed, I replied. You said I was no longer your child. You were right. I'm a Thorne. And I'm a soldier. And right now, you're an enemy combatant. I turned my back on them and walked back toward the study. I could hear Eleanor's sobbing and Desmond's muffled curses, but I didn't look back. I had a war to win. Once inside the study, I leaned against the door, closing my eyes. My hands were shaking. I wasn't as cold as I pretended to be. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest. You handled that well, Callista, Grimm said, entering the room behind me. I feel like I just executed my own family, sir. You didn't, Grimm said firmly. You defended a legacy. But don't get comfortable. Meridian Group isn't just a competitor. They're a conglomerate with ties to foreign intelligence. They wanted Thorne Industries because your father's new satellite encryption tech is the key to the next decade of global security. They used your mother and brother as pawns, but the real players are still on the board. I looked at the screen, the flashing icons were still there. Then we moved to Phase 2. I need Captain Vance to bring the intelligence team in. If Meridian wants a war over this technology, I'm going to give them one they won't survive. The rest of the night was a blur of activity. While the security team escorted a broken Eleanor and a terrified Desmond off the property, Brianna and I began the process of fortifying the Thorne digital network. We were using military-grade firewalls to lock out the board members who had been compromised. Around 3 a.m., the house finally went quiet. Brianna had put Maisie to sleep in my old nursery, and the two of us were sitting on the floor of the study, surrounded by stacks of files. Your dad was a genius, Callista, Brianna said, holding up a blueprint. He wasn't just building satellites. He was building a web. He knew exactly who would try to take his chair. He knew, I whispered. But he didn't tell me. Why didn't he tell me while he was alive, Bree? Why make me go through that funeral, that reading, that humiliation? Because he knew you had to be pushed, she said gently. If he'd told you, you would have tried to save them. You would have tried to fix Desmond and forgive Eleanor. He needed you to see them for what they really are so you wouldn't hesitate when the real fight started. I looked out the window at the sprawling gardens. I thought about the little girl who used to play out there, thinking her father was a god and her mother was a saint. That girl was gone. I'm going to call a board meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow, I said, my voice steady. I'm going to walk in there and show them exactly what happens when you try to steal from a thorn. What about the Meridian Group? I've already traced their primary server. It's located in a neutral building downtown. They think they're safe because they have legal layers. But I'm not going to sue them, Bree. What are you going to do? I looked at my uniform hanging on the rack by the door. I'm going to use the one thing Silas didn't have. I'm going to use the United States Army. General Graham didn't just come here as a friend. This technology is a matter of national security. Tomorrow morning, Thorn Industries becomes a protected government asset. And anyone who tried to compromise it is going to find themselves in a black site before the sun sets. The weight of the world was still there, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like armor. As the sun began to rise over the estate, I stood on the balcony. I looked down at the iron gates. I could see a black sedan idling a few hundred yards down the road, Meridian scouts. They were waiting for me to fail. They were waiting for the grieving daughter to break. I picked up my phone and dialed Thaddeus Sterling. Thaddeus, it's Callista. I've finished reading the files. Tell the board to be in the conference room by 0800. And tell them to bring their passports. They're either going to sign over their shares, or they're going to be escorted out by the military police. And the Meridian Group representative? Thaddeus asked. Tell him I have a message from my father, I said, watching the sedan as it finally began to drive away. Tell him the Thorn family doesn't surrender. We just reload. I went back inside to check on Maisie. She was sleeping soundly, her tiny hand curled around the edge of the blanket. Looking at her, I knew that every move I made from this point on was for her. I was going to build a world where she never had to wonder if she was loved, and where no one would ever dare to take what belonged to her. But as I watched her, a new file notification pinged on my laptop. It was an automated message from Silas, time to release 24 hours after the retinal scan. Asterisk Callista, if you are reading this, it means you have taken the matter and faced Eleanor. I am sorry for the pain this has caused. But there is one final thing you must know. The person who funded Meridian's takeover attempt, the person who truly pulled the strings, isn't a stranger. Look at the ledger from 1994. Look for the name Aria. Asterisk. My breath hitched. Aria. That was my middle name. But it was also the name of my father's first partner, the woman who had supposedly died in a car accident before I was born. I sat down, my fingers flying across the keys. If Aria was alive, if she was the one behind all of this, then this wasn't just a corporate war. It was a blood feud. And the real battle hadn't even begun. The name Aria wasn't just a ghost in a ledger, it was the key to my existence. As I dug through the encrypted 1994 files, the truth shattered every memory I had of my childhood. Aria hadn't died in a car accident. She was a brilliant scientist, Silas's true partner, and my biological mother. Eleanor had been a cold convenience, a woman who traded a loveless marriage for the Thorn name, while my father spent 30 years hiding the fact that his wife was actually the woman who had helped the Meridian Group try to dismantle him from the inside. At 0800 sharp, I didn't walk into the Thorn Industries boardroom as a grieving daughter. I walked in as a captain of the United States Army, flanked by Major General Octavius Grimm and a squad of military police. Eleanor and Desmond were already there, sitting at the head of the table with the Meridian Group representative, a man who looked far too smug for someone about to lose everything. Callista, don't be dramatic, Eleanor snapped, not even looking up from the merger documents. You've been disowned. You have no standing here. Leave before I have security throw you out. Security won't be doing anything, Eleanor, I said, my voice echoing with a command I'd honed in the field. Thaddeus Sterling stood up, clutching a leather-bound folder. Desmond let out a nervous laugh. Thaddeus, just give her the final notice so we can sign this deal. We're busy. Actually, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping an octave, all of you need to sit down. Now. The authority in the room shifted instantly. Thaddeus opened the folder, the true, final will of Silas Thorne. Silas knew of the betrayal within his own home, Thaddeus began, looking directly at Eleanor. He knew that his wife and son were conspiring with the Meridian Group to sell off the Thorne legacy. Therefore, he activated the Sentinel Protocol. As of his passing, Thorne Industries is no longer a private entity. IT has been absorbed into a joint venture with the Department of Defense. Desmond turned a sickly shade of gray. That's impossible. He can't just give the company away. He didn't. General Grimm stepped forward, resting a hand on the table. He placed it under the command of the only person he trusted with the country's most sensitive intelligence technology. Captain Callista Thorne. I looked at the Meridian representative. Your contracts are void. Your server access has been terminated. And as for the funding you received from Aria's estate, we've frozen those accounts. You're not just broke, you're under investigation for corporate espionage. Eleanor lunged across the table, her face contorted in rage. I am his wife. I spent 30 years in that man's shadow. I won't let a bastard child take what is mine. You knew Aria was my mother, I said, stepping closer until we were inches apart. You knew Silas stayed with you only to keep the Meridian Group from finding out where his real research was hidden. You weren't his partner, Eleanor. You were his distraction. The military police moved in. Desmond tried to run, but they were faster. As they were led out in handcuffs, the boardroom fell into a deafening silence. Later that evening, I stood in the Manor's nursery. Maisie was awake, playing with a small wooden plane Silas had carved for her. The war for the Thorne legacy was over, but the work of building a real home was just beginning. I wasn't just a soldier anymore, I was the guardian of a future my father had died to protect. I looked at the final photo in Silas's file, a picture of him and a woman with my eyes, laughing in a sunlit laboratory. We made it, Dad, I whispered. The Thorne family doesn't surrender. We just reload. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a ghost. I was fighting for the little girl in the crib and the truth that finally set us free. If this story reminded you that the truth is worth fighting for, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. Thanks for watching.